He expected a Chinese bride for Christmas, but not the skill that saved his farm from ruin. The frost had etched cruel, intricate patterns across the inside of the cabin window, blurring the line between the world and oblivion. For Abel, the distinction had long since ceased to matter. The world was the suffocating silence of the two-room cabin, the weight of the mortgage papers on the mantelpiece, and the hollow ache in his chest that had been a constant companion since Mary's passing. Oblivion was the endless expanse of white outside, a landscape that promised nothing but a deeper cold, a final stillness. His hands, raw and split from swinging an axe in the biting air, trembled as he stoked the meager fire. Every log burned felt like setting fire to a dollar bill he didn't have. He was a man cornered by winter, by debt, and by a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room. He had done a desperate thing, a thing the men in the town of Hardwater whispered about with a mix of pity and scorn. He'd sent away for a wife, a mail-order bride from a catalog that promised a demure and hard-working companion. He'd scraped together the last of his funds, not for love, but for a pair of hands to save his life. He needed a partner to fight this losing war against the land, and the advertisement from San Francisco had been his last desperate shot. He'd pictured someone sturdy, weathered, a woman who knew hardship. As he stared into the flames, he felt a familiar, bitter humiliation rise in his throat. He was buying a person because he had failed so profoundly on his own. The bank wanted its money by spring, or the farm his grandfather had broken his back to build would be gone. This woman, this stranger, wasn't a hope for a new life. She was the last defense against the end of the old one. The arrival of the noon stagecoach was an event that bled all the color and sound from Hardwater. It emerged from the swirling snow on the horizon, a dark, lumbering beast pulled by 4 weary horses. A small crowd of onlookers watched as the driver brought it to a halt. Abel stood apart from them, his jaw tight, his shoulders braced as if for a physical blow. The coach door opened and a figure descended. The town went quiet. It was not the sturdy, plain-faced woman anyone had expected. It was a girl, impossibly slight, swallowed by the vast, hostile landscape. She wore a dress the color of fresh blood, a vibrant red cheongsam of embroidered silk that seemed to defy the punishing monochrome of the Wyoming winter. Her hair was a knot of polished jet, her face pale and unreadable. This was Mlin. She held a single, small wooden box and stood with a stillness that was both unnerving and magnificent. The whisper started immediately, a low, cruel rustle. "That's it? That's what he spent his money on?" "A doll. He bought himself a china doll. She won't last a week." Abel felt his face burn with a shame so hot it almost felt like warmth. This was his folly, laid bare for all to see. She looked fragile, ornamental, utterly unsuited for a life of brutal, relentless labor. He had prayed for a draft horse and had been sent a canary. He strode forward, his boots crunching in the snow, avoiding the eyes of his neighbors. "You're Mlin?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She simply nodded, her gaze clear and direct, betraying no fear, no disappointment. She looked at him, then past him, at the unforgiving mountains, her expression one of calm, solemn assessment. In that moment, her composure was a quiet rebuke to the town's mockery and to his own spiraling panic. She was not wilting. She was observing. The journey back to the farm was a silent torment. The small cabin, already thick with unspoken grief and desperation, seemed to shrink further with her presence. Abel could barely bring himself to look at her. He had made a catastrophic mistake. He showed her the small cot in the corner that would be hers, the meager pantry, the grim reality of their existence. She took it all in with that same infuriating calm, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her red dress. The next morning, the crisis he had been dreading arrived in a different form. He found their only milk cow, Bess, lying in the barn, her breathing shallow, a foul sweat gleaming on her hide. A wave of cold dread washed over him. Without the cow, he would lose a vital source of food and the small income he got from selling the surplus. It was a death sentence, delivered slowly. He spent the morning trying every remedy he knew, but the animal only weakened. By afternoon, he slumped against the barn wall, defeated. The world was not just indifferent, it was actively trying to kill him. That's when Mlin appeared, moving with a silence he was already coming to recognize. She walked directly to the cow, her silk slippers impossibly clean on the dirt floor. She ran a slender hand down the animal's neck, felt its jaw, and then, to his astonishment, gently pried open its mouth and sniffed its breath. Abel straightened up, a surge of irritation cutting through his despair. "There's nothing to be done. She's finished." Mlin ignored him. She went to the hay trough, sifting through it with a focus that was absolute. After a moment, she plucked something from the pile, a dried, brittle weed with a faint purple flower. She brought it to him. "This," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "She has eaten this. In my home, it is called bitter root sleep. It paralyzes the gut." Abel stared at the weed, then at her. "That's just common scuff weed. It's harmless." "It is not harmless when it is dried by the first frost," she corrected him gently. "It changes. The poison awakens." He felt a defensive anger rise. What would a girl from San Francisco know about Wyoming livestock? Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of steel beneath the placid surface. "I am not from San Francisco," she said. "I am from Gansu province. We have raised goats and yaks on bitter mountains for 1,000 years. I know what I see." His pride warred with his desperation, and desperation won. Abel watched, a silent, skeptical shadow in the corner of the barn, as Mlin went to work. She moved with a purpose that belied her delicate appearance. Grinding herbs she produced from her small wooden box with a stone, mixing them with warm water into a dark, pungent mash. She cooed at the sick cow in a low, musical language, her touch gentle as she coaxed the animal's jaw open and administered the remedy. For the next 2 days, a new rhythm established itself on the farm. It was a rhythm of quiet, relentless competence. Mlin tended to the cow, but her work did not stop there. She walked the perimeter of the cabin, stuffing handfuls of dried moss and mud into the tiny cracks in the log walls, sealing them against the wind's relentless assault. She reorganized their dwindling sacks of flour and beans, her methodical sorting making the meager supply seem more substantial. She took Abel's worn woolen coat, its elbows threadbare, and with a needle from her box, she mended it with stitches so small and dense they were nearly invisible, making the garment stronger than it had been when new. The oppressive silence of the cabin didn't vanish, but it changed. It was no longer the dead quiet of despair, but the living quiet of purposeful work, punctuated by the soft scrape of a spoon in a pot or the rustle of herbs. The air grew warmer, the food tasted better, the cold felt less personal. Abel found himself watching her, a confusing mixture of resentment and relief churning in his gut. The house was no longer just a vessel for his grief. It was becoming a functioning homestead again. On the third morning, he walked into the barn to find Bess standing on her own 4 feet, weakly chewing her cud. A weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying lifted from his shoulders, leaving him dizzy with relief. That evening, as Mlin served a thin but savory stew, he cleared his throat. "The cow," he said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "She's better. Thank you." Mlin simply nodded, her eyes on her bowl, offering no triumphant smile, no "I told you so." The gesture was a quiet gift, allowing him to keep the tattered remnants of his pride. The necessity of a trip to Hardwater felt like a looming punishment. They were perilously low on salt and kerosene, and the journey could no longer be postponed. The thought of facing the town's derisive stares with Mlin at his side made Abel's stomach clench. He felt a grim, protective instinct now that was entirely new. He was no longer just embarrassed by her presence. He was worried for her. As they stepped into Henderson's general store, the usual coterie of farmers gathered around the pot-bellied stove fell silent. All eyes landed on Mlin, her red dress a stark accusation of otherness. Henderson, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, leaned on the counter with a smirk. "Finally decided to show off your new purchase, did you, Abel?" Another man chuckled. "She's a bit on the small side for farm work, ain't she? What's she good for? Laundry?" Abel's hands curled into fists. He opened his mouth to deliver a sharp retort, but Mlin moved first. She paid the men no mind, her attention captured by the open barrels of seed potatoes. She walked over, picked one up, and turned it over in her slender fingers. She ran a thumb over a small, discolored spot near one of the eyes. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the thick, judgmental atmosphere, "you should not sell these potatoes." Henderson's smirk faltered. "And why is that?" "They have the blight," Mlin stated simply. "It is not shown on the outside yet, but it is there. See this softness here? And the smell," she held it out. "It is the smell of the rot before it blooms. If you sell these, every man who plants them will lose his entire crop. It will spread through the soil." A dead silence fell over the store. The farmers stopped smirking and looked at each other, then at the barrel of potatoes that represented their hope for the next year. Henderson snatched the potato from her hand, his face reddening. He sniffed it, prodded the spot she had indicated, and his bluster visibly deflated, replaced by a dawning horror. In that moment, Mlin was not a fragile doll or a strange foreigner. She was an expert. Her quiet, irrefutable knowledge was a weapon far more powerful than Abel's anger. He paid for his salt and kerosene, and as they left the store, the silence that followed them was not one of mockery, but of a stunned, grudging respect. The wagon ride home was a study in a new kind of silence. It was not the suffocating, resentful quiet of their first journey, but a thoughtful, charged space. Abel kept glancing at Mlin, at the calm profile of her face as she watched the snow-laden pines slide by. He saw not a fragile girl in a foreign dress, but a woman of inexplicable depth. That night, the lamplight in the cabin seemed to pool around her. The air was thick with unspoken questions. He had to know. "Where did you learn all that?" he finally asked, his voice low. "The cow, the potatoes. It's not common knowledge." For a long moment she said nothing, her fingers tracing the rim of her tin cup. Then she reached for the small wooden box she always kept near. She opened it. Inside, nestled on worn silk, were not jewels, but dried herbs, a small, sharp-bladed knife, and a thin, rolled-up sheaf of rice paper covered in delicate painted characters and illustrations of plants. She unrolled one, showing him a drawing of the purple-flowered weed. "My family were not farmers," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the paper. "They were healers. We lived in the mountains where only the strong things grow. The knowledge is passed from mother to daughter. This," she touched the drawing, "is the first lesson. How to find the poison, and how to find the cure right beside it. There is always a balance." He saw the history there, the generations of women who had looked at the land not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a language to be read. "Why did you leave?" he asked, the question more gentle than he thought himself capable of. She looked up, and in her dark eyes he saw a flicker of a pain that mirrored his own. "A sickness came that we had no cure for." My parents, they are gone. There was nothing left for me there but ghosts. I wanted a place to build, not a place to remember." He nodded, understanding the hollowness of a life haunted by absence. He looked at her hands, so delicate yet so capable, and felt a profound, aching respect that eclipsed his earlier shame entirely. The sky began to change 2 days later. It was a subtle shift at first, the pale winter sun dissolving into a flat, bruised-looking ceiling of gray cloud that pressed down on the mountains. The wind, once a mere whisper, began to moan, a low, mournful sound that grew in pitch and intensity. A blizzard was coming, not the gentle flurries they had grown accustomed to, but a true plains monster. Abel knew the ritual. He spent the day securing the farm, his movements efficient and practiced. He checked the shutters, reinforced the barn door, and stacked a formidable wall of firewood against the cabin's eastern wall. He was a man who understood the brute force of nature. His preparations were a testament to that understanding. By evening, the world outside had vanished into a screaming vortex of white. The wind no longer moaned, it howled, clawing at the log walls, seeking entry with a malevolent intelligence. Inside, the two of them were an island in the storm. Abel felt a grim satisfaction. His defenses were holding. The cabin was tight. They were safe. It was then, above the roar of the wind, that a new sound emerged. A deep, groaning crack from overhead. He looked up at the main ridgepole, the massive log that formed the spine of the roof. It was a timber his own grandfather had set. It had held for 50 years. "It's just the cold," he said, mostly to himself. "The wood contracts." Mlin, who had been listening intently, her head tilted, shook her head. "No," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "That sound is not the cold. That is the sound of a crack widening. The wood is tired. It is breaking." He felt a flash of irritation. "That beam is thicker than I am. It'll hold." "The wind is not pushing from the side," she countered, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "It is pressing down. The weight of the snow. It is too much. The center is weak." He wanted to dismiss her, to trust the solid work of his own ancestors over the instincts of a stranger. But the memory of the sick cow held him back. Another groan, louder this time, vibrated through the cabin, and a fine dust of dried moss sifted down onto the table. His pride was a small, useless thing against the terrifying possibility that she was right. The sound that followed was not a groan, but a sharp, percussive crack, like a rifle shot inside the cabin. A long, dark fissure appeared along the length of the ridgepole, and a cascade of snow and splinters rained down, extinguishing one of the lamps. The roof sagged visibly. In that instant, terror, cold and absolute, seized Abel. The cabin was their only shelter. If the roof collapsed, they would be buried. His mind went blank with panic. He could only see the impending failure, the crushing weight of the snow. Mlin, however, moved. "The table!" she shouted, her voice a sharp command that cut through his fear. "We need to brace it, now!" He stared at her, then at the heavy oak table his father had built. "What?" "We use it as a post. Tip it on its side. The legs will hold the beam." It was a desperate, insane idea, but it was an idea. The sight of her, already straining to lift one end of the massive table, shocked him back into motion. Together they heaved the heavy table onto its side, its thick top facing the ceiling. "The rope from the barn," she commanded. "I saw it behind the door." He scrambled to get it, his movements clumsy with urgency. They worked in a frantic, coordinated rhythm, the storm's roar their only soundtrack. He used his bulk to shove the tabletop upwards against the sagging beam, while Mlin, her small frame surprisingly strong, used the rope to lash the table's legs to the sturdy floorboards, creating a crude but effective support column. "Hold it!" she yelled as he pushed with all his might, his muscles screaming in protest. A A final sickening splintering sound echoed from the beam, but then the table legs bit into the wood and the sagging stopped. They had done it. They stood back, panting, covered in dust and snow, the wind still screaming outside, but the immediate threat of collapse had passed. The cabin was wounded, but it was holding. In the flickering lamplight, he looked at her, this woman he had once dismissed as a fragile doll, and saw a survivor whose ingenuity had just saved their lives. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, imprisoning them in the wounded cabin. The world was reduced to the space between their 4 walls, the howl of the wind, and the steady, reassuring presence of the oak table holding back the weight of the sky. The terror of the crisis slowly ebbed away, replaced by a profound, shared exhaustion and a quiet intimacy that had not existed before. They spoke little, but every shared task, stoking the fire, melting snow for water, sharing a scant meal, became a conversation. On the 3rd night, the wind finally died down, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a blanket of impossible, silent white. Abel sat by the fire, watching Mlin carefully tend to a long, shallow cut on her arm, a wound she'd gotten from a splinter during their frantic repair. He reached out, his hand covering hers, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Let me," he said softly. He cleaned the wound with a rag and whiskey, his calloused thumb brushing against her skin. The simple, practical act felt more significant than any words he could summon. He looked at the ugly, lashed-together brace in the center of their home, then at her. "I thought, when that bean cracked—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The fear of what he had almost lost, not just the cabin, but the fragile new life within it, was too large for words. "But we are here," she said, her voice a soft anchor in the immense quiet. "We held it, together." He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he did not see a stranger or a mail-order bride. He saw the woman who had stood by him, who had refused to be broken by his land or his pride. "Abel," she said, her name for him a quiet claim. He leaned forward, and with a hesitation that spoke volumes of his long loneliness, he rested his forehead against hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of something deeper, a confession of dependence, a vow of partnership, an acknowledgement that this woman, sent to him by desperation and chance, had become the very center of his world. When the thaw came, it revealed a world scrubbed clean and a farm irrevocably changed. The first thing Abel did was ride to the timberline and fell the straightest, strongest pine he could find. He spent a week shaping a new ridgepole, and when he set it, he did not use his grandfather's methods, but a series of interlocking notches Mlin had sketched for him in the dirt, a design that distributed weight with an architect's grace. The scar on the cabin's ceiling became a testament not to a near disaster, but to their shared victory. News of their survival and of the ingenious repair traveled through Hardwater. The whispers of mockery were replaced by murmurs of grudging admiration. Henderson offered Abel credit at the store without being asked. Men who had once smirked at the sight of Mlin now tipped their hats. They did not understand her, but they understood competence. As the green of spring pushed through the melting snow, Mlin started a garden. She planted not just potatoes and beans, but strange hardy greens she'd grown from seeds carried in her wooden box. Their flavor was sharp and unfamiliar, but they thrived in the rocky soil. The farm began to breathe again. The fields were plowed, the new potatoes were planted, and the air filled with the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. One evening, as the sun bled purple and gold across the horizon, the two of them sat on the porch step. Abel looked at the woman beside him, whose quiet smile held the warmth of the coming summer. He reached out, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture that was now as natural as breathing. There were no grand declarations, no promises spoken aloud. There was only the solid reality of the mended roof above them, the fertile ground beneath their feet, and the steady, quiet beat of two hearts that had, against all odds, found a home in each other.